Good afternoon and welcome to Tactical Thursdays with Kemp. I'm quite excited to be here. Tactical Thursdays is officially a thing. My name is Alistair Pugin, and today I am joined by my fellow colleague Nicholas Blank, and we're going to talk to the other guy on the show in a bit. So yes, Tactical Thursdays brought to you by Kemp, where we bulletproof your security. I like I like the term. I used to bulletproof migrations, and in South Africa we've got what we call. Is it only in South Africa, Nick? Bulletproof coffee.
No, bulletproof coffee is a thing all over the world. It's actually an American thing first, but we do have it in America, England, and actually most places where English is spoken and coffee is drunk.
All right. So thanks everyone for joining us today. Just some housekeeping rules. If you cannot hear us and you can just see us speaking, you should have received in your invite a way to dial in telephonically if your audio is not working on your device. This session will be recorded. Well, it is being recorded, and we'll send you the slide deck as well as the video recording for you to consume later if you couldn't make this or if you have to jump off halfway through that. So today we actually have a gentleman in the name of David, not Dave. I don't know how people feel about that. It's some people like David and other people are okay with saying Dave. Like people call me Al, and it's not the Paul Simon song, although I do find that amusing when people go na 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 na, which is fine. You can call me Al, right? Today we have the aforementioned David O'Connor from Kemp, and you do stuff with firewalls. It's not in the, it was in the show notes. Yeah. Loadmaster product manager. That's right. A little bit about yourself, Dave. Name, surname, star sign. You're on mute.
That's an auspicious start. Hey everybody, my name is David O'Connor. Turns out only my mother calls me David these days. Everyone else calls me Dave, and formally on the slides, David as well. So I work with Kemp Technologies. I'm the Loadmaster product manager. I'm not sure if giving you my star sign helps protect your apps in 2022, but I was born in March, so maybe we can define it from there.
I'm also a March baby, so March babies are the best babies. I'm sorry for the other 11 months.
Yeah. I think we can wind it up right there. We're done.
Yeah, we can stop right there.
So
carry on, Dave.
Yeah, no worries. So I've been with Kemp close on 8 years now, or Progress as we're currently known as, working on the Loadmaster. So Loadmaster is a load balancer, but not just simply hey, let's take this bit in and round robin it to all your servers. It also offers a lot of, I suppose, security functions on it. So it's basically built like a firewall. Everything is blocked until you unblock something. So all ports are locked until you decide you want to open a port. Then we have an IPS IDS kind of snort rules on it. We also have what we call Edge Security Pack to enable front-end authentication. So Radius, Okta, so on and so forth, SAML. So enabling you to do authentication before you get to the actual back-end application. Once you've authenticated, you then have a WAF to enable you to do more layer 7 deep dive kind of protection and understand kind of what's happening at that level. And obviously in today's world, TLS 1.3, very, very important, fully supported on the Loadmaster, where we can handle HTTPS traffic, but we can also offload. So we can take your HTTPS traffic if you've given us the appropriate cert. We can offload that to HTTP in the backend if you want, or we can re-encrypt. So enable you to do the WAF, the ESP, other functions on the Loadmaster, content rules, before you send traffic to your backend application. So we feel that in one sense we're quite a strong party in protecting your apps in 2022. But I'll stop the marketing messaging for now, and maybe we'll just have a nice general conversation instead, Alistair.
Thanks, Dave. But it is important that you mentioned what you're doing around, and we are jumping into application firewalls in a bit, but the idea of what a firewall means to organizations today and what it means to organizations when they move to the cloud. It's very important to understand the change and the transition of the word firewall when we get to moving to the cloud, especially when you've got a firewall on-prem and now you're moving your workloads to the cloud and you've got the identical firewall appliance virtual appliance sitting in the cloud, and you need to have that same level of security. And a lot of organizations still generally look at security from a networking perspective. But today we're really talking about application security and what to look out for. Nick, just a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you're from. We know you're not from Limerick, which is where David O'Connor's from, according to his bio.
That's right. I'm from Cape Town. I currently reside in Cape Town, that's in South Africa. And I'm a CEO of an infrastructure consultancy. And in this role for this webinar, I'm actually presenting as what used to be relevant from an Exchange MVP point of view. And I've been an Exchange MVP for roughly about 15 years. And what's of interest for today's webinar is that I actually followed Exchange into the cloud. And so I have some strong opinions, just as you have, Alistair, in terms of your knowledge domain, about what security means and what it doesn't mean, and what boundaries are and what they aren't. So with that, let me ask you, Alistair, to introduce yourself. Who are you? What do you do? And where are you from?
And I'm the captain of the ship today. I'll be taking you on this journey around the west coast of Africa. My name is Alistair Pugin. I'm an Azure and Office Apps and Services MVP. I happen to work for Nick. I'm a CTO, and for the most part, I spend a lot of time talking to customers about the security, compliance, and identity management in the Microsoft clouds. That's where I'm at, and there's been a lot of noise recently around application security. What do you do with the applications? Primarily because customers that are on a cloud modernization, we prefer to call it cloud modernization, not just, hey, I've got a data center in another building. And part of that is modernizing your landscape. So we move Exchange sitting inside of a virtual machine, we send it across the wire and we put it in Exchange online, right? And we start consuming platform as a service instead of infrastructure as a service. And the same can be said, and customers that actually look at what their data platform and the application landscape looks like, when it comes to modernizing those two workloads, it's vitally important to understand what is available to you from cloud service providers, be it GCP, Google Cloud Platform, AWS, or be it Microsoft Cloud, that the way applications are hosted in the cloud is vastly different from the traditional three-tiered architecture that we'd expect from hosting applications on-prem. And yes, we know about the benefits of moving to the cloud, all the itties, right? Scalability, reliability, elasticity. We talk about those things, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about application security as we go through the slide deck today. But that's vitally important to organizations when they go from this application is an executable that gets deployed in a virtual machine on a front end as a server, to microservices, serverless functions, and logic apps. And the world is changing, putting things into containers. So today it's really about talking through what these applications actually require from a security perspective. And how do we mitigate the risk of breach, things like zero trust, and also what we believe network security operations, or NetSecOps, should be doing in order to mitigate the risk, implement some form of zero trust footprint, and also understand how to look at threat hunting and vulnerability management when it comes to what the world is doing, because that's the important part. You know, in the old days, we were able to, and we talked about it, I think it was last week with Dave, and we said there's this meme that was going around about 2-3 months ago where it was a glass, the front of the glass of a wall-mounted cabinet. It says, in case of security breach, break glass and pull out network cable. And you'd you'd mute your cyber attack that way, right? But today, with everything in the cloud, we don't have that sort of facility. We can't send an engineer into the data center to pull out a network cable. We need to make sure that we can harden what our applications and we can't call it a perimeter network anymore, Nick. I mean, it's no longer a perimeter.
What is the perimeter? And to be fair, it depends on how we've built our application. We could have a perimeter network, and that perimeter network, if I'm looking at a virtualized workload in Azure or anyone else's cloud, would actually have a perimeter, except if I'm using a Docker container, which could live somewhere. I could have my logic in another tier. I could have my DB in another tier. I could have a set of microservices that are all talking to each other. So I think this concept of a network perimeter when it comes to publishing a modern application can be a little bit fuzzy. And one of the things that I prefer if we think of a perimeter is that everything is actually a perimeter. And this goes back to a model that Forrester published a few years ago, which basically I'm going to summarize as nothing is trusted. And you would consider everything to be on the public internet, which is a very dark and dangerous place. And we want to protect ourselves accordingly.
Is that your final statement around that?
Well, let me ask Dave. Dave, in your experience, let's just dial it back a bit to what we know about the data center landscape. In the old days, call it 10 years ago, perimeters were very easily defined, weren't they?
Yes, I mean, even when I started my journey, I started as a developer, and in my first job, it was like, you want to talk to the internet? No, 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 no. This is your bubble. You live in this bubble. You talk to these 5 machines to enable you to write your code, deliver your code, and that's it. You don't, right? There was no such, going to the internet and checking your code or asking questions or any of this kind of stuff. You were boxed in, and if you needed anything else, you needed to go. It was a big deal. It had to be signed off, and so on and so forth. And that whole model and landscape has completely changed now, where the idea of the perimeter that I had there is, like the castle, big wall all around it, the moat, and that's changed. Now it's maybe you have a castle, you have your wall and moat, but then you get into the castle and every room you want to go into is also protected. Everything has to be protected all the way up and through and including to the application to make sure that you're getting the best level of protection for your customers accessing your application, or yourself and your staff accessing an application. So the mindset has kind of changed. And really, when you come to the kind of thought of nobody is trusted, it's kind of like maybe least privilege applied across the network. Everybody gets the least amount of privilege that they need to do their job. And then you eventually start to get a bit more trusted. Yeah, I know who you are. I see where you're coming from. I see what you want to do. You look like you're the right person. I'll give you a bit more privilege. I'll trust you a bit more to do more. And I think that's a new paradigm in thinking for people at the moment.
So let's just move over to slide number 1 on that topic, Alistair. And let's talk about identity for a second. And David, I'm going to, since you took us down the road of identity, you started talking about things like least privilege. And when we get into application design and we have to, in the old days, we would talk about defining Nick and defining Alistair somewhere, and on premises where we had this super easy model of a known subnet, a known source of identity, which was Active Directory, or if I was really clever, I would define Nick and Al separately in SQL because they would never be breached, and my credentials came out of there. So how do we think differently? And I have some opinions on this as well, but let me ask you from a developer point of view, also moving into the cloud where nothing is trusted, how do we think about identity?
I think it has to, it comes back, I think, to the corporate itself. So identity could encompass, we've given you this, let's say, this laptop. We know that this laptop is assigned to you, Alistair. We know that this laptop is yours. If we see this laptop connecting in, we kind of first of all assume that it is your laptop, it is the right laptop, we know the device, and we'll start with the assumption that it's Alistair that's actually at the keyboard. Then, based on maybe your location, we're saying you're dialing in from within kind of what we would consider to be the corporate network. You know, you're in an office, let's say, that belongs to the organization, your level of trust is increased.
Yes.
If we see that you're doing that, but 20 minutes later, you have another connection coming in from, Lusaka, well, we probably have to question how you managed to get, from Cape Town to Lusaka in the last 20 minutes, and what that means for the connection. So it's a bit more, I suppose, dynamic at the moment than it is kind of a single, I'll do one query to AD and there's some pre-configured information in there. It's more trying to know you more, know the devices that you're using to connect to or connect with, and then almost like applying a policy to that to say, here's the level of trust or privilege that I'm going to give you to connect to an application. I think the important part there is how we tie that identity to the application, which I think we're obviously going to chat to as well throughout this.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think just to turn the talking stick over to Alistair, our lives from an M365 point of view are actually relatively easy if we have the right SKUs, because just from an Office 365 point of view, we have this concept of Azure Active Directory, conditional access, and mitigating risks like impossible travel. But let's tie that down to application design.
Well, there's a couple of things to take into consideration. Yes, impossible travel is a thing. That the reasons that looks like a duck on the screen, right? So I'm assuming we're referring to authorization and authentication. So how do we authenticate a user, and what are we really doing around that? In the old days, we used to call it duck typing, right? It walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, it looks like a duck, it's a duck, and that's how we went about authenticating users, right? Claims-based authentication. In today's modern world, we have two-factor authentication. Dave, you talked about integrating into Ping and Okta. Duo, I take it as well. And when we look at your directory services providers available to the world today, it's important to be able to establish trust. Or when we look at zero trust, it's about a signal, right? How do we interpret a signal? So one is make sure that MFA is enabled, and this is not necessarily for public access to your platform, because you might be hosting an application that people can buy show tickets for a Justin Bieber concert, right? And then it's someone who has to register, and there's some form of MFA that you might enable. But the first thing, and it's like that old song, I got 99 problems, or 99 red balloons, right? And it's all about that. So when we look at what is the easiest way to fix access control issues, is one, enable multi-factor authentication. According to Forrester, I think it was a 2019 research article. According to Forrester, switching on MFA solves 99% of your problems. Right? So it's anyone that's not running MFA when it comes to identity, please consider switching on multi-factor authentication, even if it's for users from a role-based access control perspective that's accessing your publicly published application on your perimeter edge, where you've got a public-facing application where people are interacting with it, consumers. So for me, definitely start with identity. Make sure that you understand what identity means. To Dave's point, we talk about least privileged or least privilege, the concept of least privilege. We also talk about privileged identity, just enough and just in time access, and privileged access management, because anything more than the least amount of privileges required to perform a specific task is seen as privileged, right? So make sure that you understand what that model looks like. And then it's all about being able to assess where the user is coming from now that we've identified who the user is, right? So impossible travel policies we've spoken about. Look at those signals and then decide what you're doing. And it's a continuous evaluation. It's not just, hey, that's done once and we've moved on. But I think we spent enough time talking about where identity is going in the world. For me, the next thing, once you've moved on from, I now know who this user is, or I now know what this group of users are because I've defined that. Naturally, you want to get to what is the application going to do, because you've got the authentication pillar sorted, and now it's authorization into the application. And traditionally, and David, you mentioned something about a WAF. So Dave, coming from the developer landscape, we used to spend a lot of your time in it and starting to look at what firewalls means to the cloud. What have your experiences been specifically to things like web application firewalls?
Yeah, I mean, we're chatting about the Forrester report, and a lot of people probably read the Verizon breach report as well. And that from 2016 to 2019 has called out insecure software as the number one cause of data breaches, or actually according to that Verizon breach report. And in that, web app attacks is the number one. Again, so within that 40%, the number one in that is web app attacks. And that's where the web application firewall is coming in. It's where it's looking at that layer 7 traffic and it's just going, hey, look, does this look like it's a properly formed SQL command? Is it kind of going to the right place? And what is it doing? And it's really, really important that, you understand the coding aspect of your application and that you're kind of writing code with security in mind so that you're making sure simple things. If a field input is all numbers, check that it's all numbers, that you can't have A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3 in there. OAuth can help you detect things like that and forms, but if you're doing it at the application layer, you're making sure that if someone has got past everything else, that you've still got a level of protection at the application layer. Going back to that idea of the castle, the moat, and every room being protected, you also need to look at the application, but it's worthwhile having a WAF sitting in front that is just giving you that extra check against all of the layer 7 values that are going through, and making sure that, yeah, this looks like it's properly formed. It doesn't look like it's malicious. And a WAF will look at IP reputation. You can have it configured to take Tor exit node stuff, and it will check the client IP, where stuff is coming from, before it even lets it go through. So it's adding just another layer of kind of checks and validation as to the client traffic, as to the formatting of the messages, what they look like, should be properly formatted, and then really trying to help further protect an application.
A question on that before we move off that point, and just integrating the first and the second topic. What is the point of having an application firewall when from the outside you're still prompting for basic authentication as opposed to modern authentication?
So I suppose there's two slightly different things. So you have your person coming in and you're basically checking their identity. Now, you can do basic and you should do modern, and you should do modern with a password manager and make sure you've got a really long password, all of the usual good security advice. And that's great. That basically says you're a person. But after that check, it's what is the traffic that you as that person are sending to that application, and is that traffic deemed to be malicious? Because I could be sitting behind or beside you in a coffee shop and see you enter in a 3-digit or 4-digit code to get access to your laptop. You close it, you go to the bathroom, I enter that. So now at the authentication level, well, people think it's you. But then I start sending down malformed HTTP requests into an SQL database that you have access to. that's what you're then trying to catch. It's that next layer beyond just, identifying the person that's connecting.
It's funny that you mentioned that. I did one of the Azure boot camps we did. I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, and no, it was the first season of Discovery. They were still talking about a SQL injection, right? And it's still relevant. And to your point, David, you talked about, well, we want to understand the communication between the request store and the application. So is it malicious of intent, right? Are you trying to inject something? Is it a request? And when you start looking at web application firewalls, there's a rule set that you can actually build. And a lot of the times, what's nice about these cloud providers is, and also purchasing firewalls from firewall providers, is they stay on top of what's happening globally when it comes to these sorts of things and these sorts of vulnerabilities. And they generally have a pre-baked set of rules. It's the same with CDN providers like Cloudflare. There's a set of rules that's baked in that you can switch on, because the big thing here is, in the old days, it was easy, right? Port 443, everything else deny all, right? That was the easy way. And it works a little bit different now, because hackers are industrious humans, and they tend to figure out ways to get around these things because they understand the application. A lot of times when we talk about products like WordPress, WordPress is fine, but it's a bad plugin. And when we go into the next slide, we're going to talk a bit more about that. But it's really about understanding what rule sets are shipping with the firewalls that you are purchasing. And that's really where the value proposition is, because you as an organization, you don't have time during the day to spend looking into, this is the latest global security report that says this is the type of hack that's happening currently. This is a 0-day hack, and it's because there's a vulnerability that's been exposed in application Y, right? And the rule sets that these firewall providers have do definitely help you with your security posture around making sure that the application's secure, not just the network secure. Now, once that's concluded, we now have made sure that we've hardened the application. We understand what firewall rules are. We understand what firewall rules we want to implement so as to not degrade the performance of the application, and also degrade the performance of people that need to interact from a front end and a back end with the application. Because there's things like, okay, no admin access to the application from the firewall directly. And then people would have to VPN and use a different gateway to get in. Sometimes you don't necessarily want to do that. So my advice around application firewalls, and not just application, but web application firewalls and application gateways, is to understand the rule sets in its entirety before you just switch these things on, because you could pull your entire system down with a rule. Now, we've looked at identity. We focused a bit on the application ecosystem because modernized everything. But should we take it a step further and start analyzing it at a source code level, right? Because the developers are writing the code, there's going to be a pull request, it's sitting in a repo, it might or might not go through some sort of quality gating. Someone's going to hit publish, or well, someone's going to click a pull request, and then it's going to be published through a DevOps pipeline to production, right? Because they've gone through unit tests in Dev and UAT, and now all of a sudden they're releasing code that might not have been checked for well, someone that wrote some bad code with vulnerabilities, right? Or there's a way of getting in. Nick, you've spent a little bit of time with platforms like GitHub and being able to publish things. And because you come from an infrastructure background, are infrastructure people being exposed to worrying about source code?
Not at all. When I was learning about Terraform, as an example, one of the things that had to be explicitly pointed out to me when I started using any type of source code repository, actually doesn't matter if it was PowerShell or Terraform, is the kind of vulnerability that you're opening yourselves up to just by storing credentials in your source code. Because And if we talk about credentials, we're talking about managed identities, keys, API keys that are actively being targeted by bad actors. And this was something that I had to learn about. And this, talking from a dev point of view, is, or as an infrastructure person, there are so many things where we modernize and learn about infrastructure as code, where we need to talk to folks like developers who've very mature in this and understand about credential management outside of the repo, as an example. And there, it doesn't actually matter if it's PowerShell, if it's Terraform, if it's any of your infrastructure as code or YAML definitions, as long as your code has the thinking, and this is what you were talking about earlier, as long as the thinking is baked in about, well, what about security? What does that look like? So that includes credential management and security at every port of call, every type of outset. So for me, that meant just the very basics. If I'm going to publish something to a public or private repo, even a private repo, make sure there's no credentials or API keys of any sort that are vulnerable because they're just in the code.
Dave, have you spent any time looking at, well, we know with things like managed identities, you'll move from a service principal to a managed identity because it's better, right? And you'd use a managed identity to handle this, because the concept of service accounts is not really there yet. And managed identities are associated with an application and only an application. Right? And then we talk about application keys, and we talk about secrets, and where do you store secrets, right? Because do you put in your key vault? Are you going to do some sort of container orchestration with Kubernetes and store it in that push? David, have you spent a lot of time with developers around how to have a look at where you are storing your source code and what actually goes with storing your source code?
I suppose on our side, the guys, I think, like most people, are probably using just a Git repository for stuff, and it's about, to Nick's point, about being very conscious about what you put in there and what you store, be it public or private, because what actually kind of tends to happen is that, yes, you're working on your laptop, but your laptop is kind of mobile, because you might be going to the office, you might be, working from home, you stop off in your mother-in-law's on the way home to get a bit of dinner or something, right? And then, your laptop is mobile, right? So if your laptop goes and you have the source code on it and you have the keys in it, then you've immediately kind of opened the doors to the castle at every level. So it's really about security conscious training to developers to make sure that they understand the implications of source code management and best practices around that. And it's not something, at least in an Irish perspective, when I went to college, that was ever really kind of spoken to or spoken about. So you have people learning to write code. Everyone could learn to write code, Python, Java, whatever kind of takes your fancy. There's plenty of online resources to tell you, to answer your questions when you get stuck. But nobody ever really talks about security in relation to code and what that means and how to kind of really bring that to the front of your development. And the issue is that if you don't, it appears in your application, and it gives a bad actor a more of a surface to attack. And the more of a surface that you have to attack, the more likely they are to actually break through.
That's an interesting point that you've mentioned, because when we were putting together this, my thoughts around managing source code, right? Make sure that the Git repo is private, and you manage the identity management getting in, right? And I never really thought about, well, shit, man, I have it doesn't matter if the source code's in the cloud and it's provisioned that way. I'm still connecting. The endpoint is the problem here, right? I go and, like you said, I walk into a coffee shop and I don't want to sit at my desk at home because of COVID. I'm going to work for a couple of hours from a coffee shop. And someone is sitting there with a Pineapple device and spoofing a network, spoofing an access point. So I log into that to get my free 3 hours worth of Wi-Fi, and my identity is compromised. And that person then has access to impersonate me and have access to my source code. And then from there, that user, that person, could then inject malicious code into that repo, and that can then get published as part of your application. So it's no longer, and we started talking about perimeter security, right? It's no longer about the perimeter. The security is extended to the edge, right? Whoever is consuming and working with the application should be profiled at risk. So when we talk about zero trust, it comes back to that. Okay, this is a signal where this user has been writing code from his desk and from a managed device. And then he moves away from to an undisclosed location where we don't trust that necessary IP address range. So we don't allow the user in. And when we start looking at not only least privilege, but what zero trust means, these are the things that, in your example, David, it would mitigate that risk, because we want to trust the device, and not only the authentication, but the signals around where they're coming from. In this case, it would be a location that might be compromised, or we don't know enough about the location. We risk model and say, sorry, you cannot access, you cannot code from here because it's not a pre-approved location. So it's not just about the source code per se, it's also about where the source code is being accessed from.
Yes, yeah. You're trying, it's almost, if I was to really draw a thin thread, it's almost like a supply chain thing, where you're really kind of checking where everything came in that supply chain to make sure that there could be no point of compromise to put something into source code that would negatively affect you.
Yeah, and moving into our next segue. Now that we've spoken about identity, we understand what source code is doing. We understand how to protect the application. But naturally, this application needs a database to write to. 99% of applications would write to some form of table structure or NoSQL, right? Where it's just a big information methane and a content black hole where you just drop content in and hopefully you can get content back out. But 9 out of 10 times, applications write information to a database. You've got a form that you're capturing, the way it's rendering, some form of functionality, information and states are stored in the database. Now, when we look at data level security, Nick, you positioned how you can do it at a network level. So you've got a web tier, you've got a data tier, you've got an access tier, you've got a compute tier, right? And that's all ring fenced with a network security group, like a DMZ, and that's how you're managing communication between the application layer and the data layer, right? David, you spent a lot of time talking to customers about how to lock down their data. What are you doing? What are you seeing the current trends are in your space around talking to data in a cloud modernized ecosystem?
It's when it comes to the actual data itself, it is to keep it as even more tightly locked down than you consider any other part, because the data is the IP. The IP is what's your business. So if you have an application running and it's talking into a backend database, you want them kind of separated. You want to make sure that it is locked down at the database level itself. So maybe in the cloud, you might have a VPC that's really, really tightly locked down, that is kind of running in its own particular area that only certain people, only certain IPs could get access to, that you need a high level of privilege to be able to do so. And really it's about taking all of the principles that we've had to date and ultra focusing in on them to make sure that that data is as rock solid as possible, that only the right people at the right time can get access to it. And anything else needs to just be, I'm sorry, you're not at a level, or you're not we don't believe that you should be having access to this data, because losing that that's what costs your company the money.
And Nick, are infrastructure people still nonchalant about what data platform looks like when it comes to the modernized data platform ecosystem? Because in the old days, the infrastructure people, we used to call them the Wintel people, right? Windows and Intel, and the DBAs would worry about it. And as long as they had some sort of unified access gateway or threat management gateway sitting somewhere, you'd have a, a traditional OLE-DB connection or a SQL query string into the database. And a lot of times that wasn't really encrypted anyway, right? Because it's not how it worked, right? We'd send it across and get access to it. And the way a cloud modernized structure, when we talk about Azure SQL, right? And what sort of types of databases you can actually run in the Azure cloud, Postgres, Cosmos, Maria, MySQL. You get the richness of what you can do from a firewall perspective with that. So how do people access the database? And you can put it behind an application gateway and apply some sort of firewall rules to that, not only through the web application firewall, but you can also start looking at how people access the database, and using something like a managed identity would definitely help. And I'm going to segue because we are running a little bit short on time, and we've got about 20 minutes left, and we still need to field some questions. Now, locking down your data platform, definitely, and when you start looking at the cloud providers, the AWSs, the GCPs, and the Microsofts of today's world, there's a lot you can do around the concept of managed identities and keys and secrets. And that extends to platform as a service databases. Traditionally, we'd install Oracle on top of a virtual machine. We'd install Microsoft SQL on top of a virtual machine. But when we move to the cloud, what a lot of application developers are opting for, and when we do data platform modernization, we look at that as well, where we are wanting to use platform as a service databases that are in the Microsoft world. They have native databases like Azure SQL 4 or Azure for MySQL database and Azure for MariaDB, and it's native to the platform, so you get all the scalability options and the scale sets and those things. But it also consumes the native services that are available. So if you had a Kemp web application firewall or Fortinet or one of those deployed, you can start consuming that very much the same way as you would any of the other native services to the platform. So I'm very, very excited about what data platform modernization and application modernization is done. When you put an application in a container, and that container can be locked down because applications now worry about container security, firewalls and application gateway providers worry about serverless security, and there's quite a lot that's been done in that space to protect data, and primarily it's your biggest asset. But when we start looking at why is data so important to your organization, is compliance, right? And the breach is not so much about my identity has been stolen out of a database that you host because I've registered to receive notifications, or I've logged in with a username and a password. But it's really about what regulatory compliance and legislative compliance globally is, and what ushered this big thing, the elephant in the room. And it used to be an elephant in the old days, but in today's world, regulations like the General Data Protection Regulation of the European Union has ushered, it's a regulation so they can sue you if there's a breach, right? If you are storing EU citizen data, and this is just one of the controls inside of it, and they hacked your database and they've got personally identifiable information such as name and surname of an EU citizen, the European Union can sue you. It's not the person's information. They can sue you. It's a fine that you have to pay. You know, you've got to notify everyone that's in that database of the breach within 72 hours, and it can start costing organizations money if they don't look at statutory compliance and regulatory compliance standards inside of countries. Right, Nick, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I did, and so a second ago, you asked me if I was nonchalant about data security from an infrastructure point of view. And previously, our world from an infrastructure point of view was relatively simple because it's data at rest, data is encrypted, and data in motion, and data is encrypted. And something that Dave spoke to earlier was it's not just about the access path to the data, because the tiers of machines are separated from each other, so you actually can't get to the data from the internet in theory. So it gets to how do you get to that data and how do you use that data, which is very much a compliance topic. And something that I like to position from a compliance point of view is it's not just optional. And Alistair and I being C-levels means that we speak to businesses about the R word, risk. Now, what compliance is meant to do is actually drop the level of risk if implemented correctly, and that speaks to data governance as well. So last week, we had a very sad incident in Russia where a compliance certificate was forged and miners died. So that's a very hard impact of compliance. If we look at what could happen in the energy field, again, non-compliance could mean that nuclear reactors literally shut down because they're not being run in a compliant manner. Now, from a data point of view, identity, as well as all the other previous 4 topics that we spoke about, compliance and handling any one of the 4 pillars that we spoke about earlier in a compliant manner, while in some senses more arduous, if we realize what compliance could be doing for us in terms of reducing risk, in some cases saving lives, depending on the industry that we're talking about, then we get out of the space of thinking that GDPR is inconvenient, or that SOX, which basically came about after Enron, and we spent more money on compliance than we did before anything really. So these things were forced on us, but compliance can be the right things for the right reasons. And I want to throw that in there as having to adjust my thinking as an infrastructure person. So compliance is not just a nice to have, it's actually there for a reason. And putting my business hat on as an executive, compliance is definitely not a nice to have because it keeps me and it keeps you from the orange jumpsuit with the free silver jewelry that comes with it when we violate legal compliance.
Look, if you look at the slide, it's got a superhero at the back, right? And it always goes back to conversations with great power comes great responsibility. And onboarding cloud services into your organization when it comes to publishing applications, specifically in a modernized way, microservices, functions, logic apps, those sorts of things, containers, Kubernetes, and how you are publishing content to the cloud. It's vitally important to understand. And it's also use case driven, right? You talk about highly regulated industries, nuclear power, right? NIST is a compliance framework that you need to subscribe to. And in order to be a regulator, you need to be compliant in NIST. We know that anyone that talks to the hospitality industry would definitely need to be GDPR compliant. So with all the hotel groups, now that we can hopefully start traveling again, although Omicron not discovered in South Africa, didn't originate in South Africa, just to get back to the latest news. We just have really good scientists that pick these things up, except we get blamed for it. Like, you know, half of the sub-Saharan Africa got blamed for identifying a COVID variant, right? It's quite annoying. Anyhow, if the World Health Organization was compliant, they would have said, well, South Africa identified it and they weren't responsible for it. But I mean, that's just me taking a dig at the Rona times that we live in. But it's important to understand what compliance means to your organization. And when moving to the cloud, it's as simple as looking at what compliance templates are available to you. So how do you apply CIS benchmarks to your cloud infrastructure? How do you look at ISO compliance? How do you look at FedRAMP compliance or FINRA compliance or HIPAA compliance or GXP compliance? It really depends on which industry you are in. And that they've made it really easy, right? Follow the compliance laws, the regulations, follow the steps that are made available to you so that your platform is compliant. And 99, and I'll use 99% of the time, if you apply the set out rules by these compliance standards, you win. So the 4 things we talked about today was identity, app, source, data. But if you approach it from the 5th thing here, from being compliant, those 4 things become much easier to handle when it comes to what you need to do. Start there. It's vitally important because these rule sets are available to you. You don't need to spend a lot of money and effort in understanding it because it's interpreted for you. So we're coming up to 50 minutes after the hour. And I'm going to do a round robin thing here because we've taken you through identity, what to do around access control, authorization, and authentication, how to protect your applications, be it legacy or modern, be it on-prem or in the cloud. But in this case, we're talking about the cloud. We talked about what source code means to the world. And actually, I've just learned a new thing. It's not just about source code. It's about the endpoint accessing the source code. So extend your endpoint management, or at least your compliance around what endpoints means from a zero trust perspective, and include that in how people interact with your source code, understand what it means to be data, understand what you're doing around data when it comes to classification and identification and what to do with data and how your application accesses the data. And lastly, lead from a compliance perspective to achieve better operational efficiency inside of the organization. Nick, your final thoughts on what we spoke about today?
I think everything that we spoke about can seem very daunting. And I want to maybe give our listeners and those who are watching us, maybe live or even after the fact, a starting point. The starting point for me is the regulatory compliance that you are under. If you're not in a regulated industry, then very strongly consider what zero trust means. And that's a Forrester framework. It's not a Microsoft framework or a Cisco framework, although every vendor has their interpretation of it. So consider what zero trust means. And then also look at, then in order, what CIS means. CIS is a incremental standard that allows you to become more mature as you look at hardening your infrastructure. And this is very much an infrastructure view, although we can apply those disciplines to identity and other disciplines as we move from CIS 1 to 2 and then CIS 3. And if you're really feeling brave, then I would suggest that you start with Alistair's favorite framework, which is NIST. So where do we start? Let's start somewhere. Let's go from zero trust. Consider CIS and NIST as your starting points. And even if you are in a regulated industry and it appears to be very daunting, seeing your view through a NIST lens when it comes to compliance is a really good point to start.
Thanks, Nick. David, your stuff?
Yeah, I think as you're thinking through this, and especially when it comes to compliance, you need to think about the controls based on the criticality of information. So making sure that, I suppose, not everything is at the highest level of security. Otherwise, you're going to struggle to meet your governance goals. Plus, you're going to increase the complexity in enabling people to get access to that defined critical data. So you really need to look at it very, I can't say critically again, can I? But you need to look at it very objectively, I guess, as to the data, as to the people and the use cases that are going to be accessing it, and then the compliance and the controls that you put around the data at that point. And that will then feed into all of the other topics that we've spoken to today. But again, to Nick and Alistair's point, you're leading from a compliance standpoint.
So that's the official statement then. 2 out of 3, and you get the third vote from me. Lead from a compliance standpoint to look at being able to handle vulnerabilities and mitigate the risk and apply best practices to reduce threats inside of your organization, right? And zero trust, definitely. Assume breach and start there, right? Thank you very much, everyone, for spending time with us today. Please be on the lookout. For those that have registered, this webinar will be on demand and you'll be able to download it. And there's some paraphernalia that is going to come with that. Once again, thanks, Progress and Kemp, for spending some time with us today. And if you need to get hold of David, how do people get hold of you?
Yeah, it's dave.o'connor@progress.com.
Are you on the interwebs and Twitterati? There's no
David O'Connor? I am on the Twitter. Dave P. O'Connor @Dave P. O'Connor is the handle, or just email me direct, reach out, and happy to have a conversation with anyone. As a product manager, that's a big part of the role. So we'd love to talk to people about this topic and zero trust further.
Awesome stuff. Nick, how do we get hold of you?
Easiest place is to find me on Twitter. That's @Nicholas Blank. That's Nicholas without an H. NicholasBlank. Otherwise, you can also find me on LinkedIn. And do send me a join request with a message that makes sense for us to connect. Otherwise, you may get lost in sometimes the flood of connections that we get from various marketers and people who want to hire us.
Great stuff. Thanks, everyone. My name is Alistair Pugin. You can find me on the interwebs @Alistair Pugin everywhere. I'm not on TikTok or Snapchat. And I'll happily chat to you about security, compliance, and identity management solutions. And please do reach out to Kemp to chat to you about what they've done and their investments in this space. And that's a wrap, people. Ciao, ciao. Say goodbye now.